Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Alex Roginski, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's author event with Dr. Meg Foster. I would like to begin, as with any event, but particularly for one which is about history, by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Gulidjan and Gadibanud peoples of the Maar Nations as the original owners of the lands on which the Geelong Library Services operate. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, knowledge and story. I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders of the lands from which Meg and I join you today. For me, it's the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Brunswick or Merribik, and for Meg, it is the Eora people. Some brief housekeeping before we begin. Today, Meg and I are going to talk for a lively 40 minutes, and we'll then take questions, and I'm really keen to hear your thoughts and what kind of ideas might have come up for you from this discussion. You can participate in this webinar by clicking on the Q&A button at the top of your browser and typing your question or comment. Also, this webinar is being recorded. If you'd like to watch this discussion again or recommend it to friends or family, it will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So who am I and why am I here today? I am a Melbourne-based historian, writer and heritage professional and a visiting fellow of Deakin University and the State Library of New South Wales. My work investigates practices and ideas of the body, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries in Australia, and I'm the author of 2 books, most recently a new book with a very long name from Cambridge University Press, Science and Power in the 19th Century Tasman World, Popular Phrenology in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. But importantly for our business tonight, I am a mere accomplice in this evening's intellectual hold-up. We are here to talk about a remarkable work of history, a book that takes us to the rough and tumble new settlements and country of southeastern Australia, as well as to distant shores. A book about crime, family, policing and white myth making, a book penned by the one and only Dr. Meg Foster. Meg is an award-winning historian of banditry, settler colonial and public history. She is currently the Mary Bateson Research Fellow for the Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at Newnham College, University of Cambridge, and a visiting fellow with the School of Humanities and Languages at UNSW. Her first book, Boundary Crosses, which we're here to discuss tonight, was published with New South last year in 2022 and has recently been longlisted for the British Academy Book Prize in Global Cultural Understanding and the Davitt Award in Non-Fiction Crime Writing. And I'm sure that there will soon be many more to add to that list, Meg. It's a fantastic book and I'm thrilled to open this discussion tonight. And I've got a question that kind of lays the foundation for what we'll be discussing. What or who was a bushranger?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. That seems like a very basic question. I'm sure many people in the audience have their own ideas. By virtue of being Australian, these figures are a part of really our everyday lives. My kind of working definition of a bushranger is someone who robs and then goes to either roam or hide in the Australian bush. But it's actually not even that simple. So bushranging has a long history and it changes over time. The bushranging that we would imagine today, someone like Ned Kelly as the kind of epitome of who we think of as a bushranger, he's actually a little bit late on the scene when it comes to bushranging history. And the first bushrangers were actually convicts, escaped convicts who went to live in the bush. And in the early days, there weren't very many honest means to survive in the wilderness, to quote one police report. And so the idea was that the only way a convict could actually live in the bush was to rob to survive. And then by the 1860s, we're looking at the golden age of bushranging. Those kind of convict bushrangers had kind of gone. And we're now looking at men who describe themselves as natives. And they mean native in the sense that they had been born in the colony. We're talking about white men, usually the descendants of convicts who are then robbing in the Australian bush. And then finally, about probably a decade too late to be a part of this bushranging golden age, we have the infamous Ned Kelly, who's kind of a straggler, but I'm sure we can get back to that a little bit later. So yeah, bushranging has a long history.
And if it died out in the 1880s, Meg, why are we still talking about them? And what did people think of them at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, bushrangers today are national heroes, national symbols, because we see them epitomizing this idea of egalitarianism, anti-authoritarianism, the idea we love an underdog, don't we, as Australians, someone fighting back against an injustice. And bushrangers seem to nicely encapsulate all of those different values. But of course, these are mythic values, they're heroic values, and they don't necessarily map on to bushrangers as historical figures, as real people. And so that disjuncture gets to your second question about how do people actually see them in their own times. And the answer is it's complicated, it's messy. No one saw them all in the same way. So while there was definitely support in bushrangers' own times, there were, bush ballads and folk songs, even when these bushrangers were operating, there were also people who actively hated these figures, who felt that their lives and properties were compromised by them, people who wanted to actively hunt these bushrangers down. And so I think that keep bearing that in mind, this kind of separation, if we can have it in our minds, between the myth that we know today and the reality of what bushranging actually was, is going to help us really navigate our discussion, I think.
Fantastic, Meg. And I guess if, we have all, grown up with a kind of pretty baked in idea of what bushrangers are. And I certainly always thought, oh, Ned Kelly, it's probably not my kind of history. So my question is, how did you become interested in bushrangers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you could call it an interest. I had a base level knowledge of bushranging by virtue of being Australian, right? By growing up here, going and seeing, regional museums with different kind of items of, guns and bits of armor, etc., relating to different bushrangers and seeing, the lovely Heath Ledger as Ned Kelly, for example. Um, but my real interest in bushranging started when I realized that I didn't know the whole story. So I'm really interested in the people who get left out of history, the ones whose voices we don't hear clearly and who we really need to search actively for in their records. And I was speaking to a colleague when I was still at university. He was like, oh, Aboriginal bushrangers are really understudied. I was like, what? There were Aboriginal bushrangers? I had no idea that these people existed. And then from that one conversation, I realized that there were other bushrangers, people of color and women who were committing, the same crimes at the same time as these famous white bushranging men who we remember today, but who have completely been erased from our national bushranging mythology. And so my interest really came in trying to figure out who these people were and why their stories hadn't been told until really now.
Mm. Which leads us to the people who make it into your book. And unfortunately, there are no pictures of Heath Ledger. I have to warn people. But it is wonderful, and the stories more than make up for that. So can you tell us about who the four protagonists are who we'll be talking about and meeting today, Meg?
Yeah, sure. So the book opens with a man named William Douglas, also known as Black Douglas, also known as many other things. He had many aliases. So Douglas was an African American man originally from Philadelphia, but he's most famous and infamous as this kind of pseudo figure, Black Douglas of the Victorian goldfields of the 1850s. Next, the book moves on to Sam Pu, who's a Chinese bushranger originally from the Fujian province of China. And he becomes very infamous for a murder he's alleged to have committed in 1865, the murder of a senior constable in New South Wales. Then the book progresses to the two Aboriginal bushrangers of the book. So we've got Warramai Aboriginal woman Mary Ann Bugg, who some listeners might know from any type of reports of Captain Thunderbolt. She's known as his partner and kind of helpmate, but I'm obviously interested in her on her own terms as the protagonist of her own story. And then finally, the book looks at Jimmy Governor, who, once again, listeners might be recognizing the name from a Thomas Keneally novel from the 70s, The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. It's a fictionalized version. So Jimmy Governor was basically famous in 1900 for murdering the family of his white employer and then going on a crime spree throughout New South Wales that lasted over 3 months. So one local historian calls it the largest manhunt in Australian history. And although there is obviously some reporting about these figures and some kind of local pockets of memory about them, there's so much of their stories that just isn't public knowledge, and that's what I was trying to get at with writing the book that I did.
Mm. And who did you meet first of these four protagonists? And how did your views about them change as you began your research? Because it feels as though so much of this intervention into bushranging history is really having our expectations turned upside down in some ways.
Yeah, completely. So I met the two Aboriginal bushrangers of the book first. So as I kind of motioned to, there was a little bit written about them. So Mary Ann Bugg as the kind of the partner in life, but also in crime of the famous white bushranger Captain Thunderbolt. And then Jimmy Governor through this kind of fictionalized version that Thomas Keneally wrote in the 70s. Those were my kind of entry points. But very quickly I realized that those entry points weren't enough. They definitely weren't the whole story. And so the idea that Mary Ann Bugg, for instance, is someone who's kind of a peripheral figure, someone in the background of the larger Thunderbolt story, really undermines and does a disservice to how remarkable her life was, her ingenuity, her savviness, the way she's able to navigate some pretty oppressive structures as an Aboriginal woman in this period of history, and also just some remarkable instances where really truth is stranger than fiction, and those types of events that just get sidelined but actually really make the story. So one such instance, and one that I begin the chapter on Mary Ann talking about, where in 1865 the police are on the hunt for Thunderbolt and he's gone, he's left, but Mary Ann's there with her children and some alleged stolen property. Now, instead of going with the police quietly, she's alleged to have called them cowards for trying to arrest her, not Thunderbolt. She's meant to have challenged one to single combat and to have leapt off her horse and ripped an officer's shirt to ribbons. And eventually, they get her and the children and they're going to the police station, and Mary Ann's heavily pregnant at this time, and she actually claims to be going into labor. Just so police like, oh God, woman's business, we can't deal with this. So they leave her at the closest property to go continue their hunt for Thunderbolt. But miraculously, when the police leave, Mary Ann's contractions appear to stop because she's able to swiftly escape with the children. So I love that story. And of course, the newspapers of the time may have been leaning into the drama a little bit. But what they really show for me is someone who's incredibly canny, who's actually got a real strength of character and not afraid to kind of stand up for herself, but also uses what she has at her disposal for her own ends to advance her own interests. And that's what really got me hooked with her story.
That is a remarkable story. What else did you learn about Mary Ann Bugg, about where she came from, and about the choices that she made during her remarkable life?
Yeah, so Mary Ann is the daughter of a convict of the Australian Agricultural Company called James Bugg, and a Warramai Aboriginal woman who we know as Charlotte. She actually marries quite young. She's a teenager at the time, but it's in the 1860s that she really hits the historical stage, hits the archives, hits the newspapers as the partner of Captain Thunderbolt. And a lot of the research about her has focused on these few years she spends with Thunderbolt from 1863 round to about 1867. And she's meant to have, been his kind of lady love. There's this kind of chivalric kind of language used, almost like a Maid Marian type figure is the way that she's described or self-described as well to kind of advance her own interest when she's before the court, for instance. She calls herself the captain's lady, which I love. But one of the things that shifts a little bit when we look at her life in its entirety is the fact that these bushranging years are very short by comparison to her long life. So the myth about Marianne goes that in 1867 she becomes desperately ill and Thunderbolt tends to her, but she passes away and under the alias of Louisa Mason. But in fact, if we actually look at the records, we can see that Marianne did not perish in 1867. This was another woman, and she actually died in 1905, well after Thunderbolt himself was killed at Uralla in 1870. And so that longue durée, that period after Thunderbolt, is what I'm particularly interested in, because it seems that she actively chose to leave that relationship, to leave her life of crime, and to actually settle down. And she actually established a relationship that wasn't new. She picked up a relationship that she'd previously had before she knew Thunderbolt with a man named Burroughs, and they had many more children. She becomes a nurse, she owns property, and she dies at the ripe old age of 70. And this is pretty remarkable, and I'm sure we'll get on to that a little bit later, like what we think of when we think of bushrangers and what we should be celebrating.
Mm-hmm. And it also leads us into some of the more trickier aspects of doing history, where we're working with figures who don't leave archives or leave patchy archives or archives that are not written by people who are sympathetic to them. And I'm wondering what the story of Marianne Bugg tells us about these gaps between historical sources and mythology, and then also between the sources and individual motivation. That question of, what would have driven Marianne in her choices that she made, including her romantic choices along the way.
Yeah, I mean, Marianne's case is particularly interesting because normally we see someone slipping from the historical record as kind of a sign that there's something wrong, that they've failed in some type of way, because there's no trace of them anymore. They're too ordinary to have left some type of archival trail. But when we look at Marianne's life and we look at her circumstance and we look at the way that she actually chose to live after she left Thunderbolt, that is incredibly remarkable. So for someone to have been so infamous, so well known, and to have actually actively engaged in crime, to then be able to live in relative obscurity afterwards, to have had this immense family as well. Like if we're looking even at the standards for women at the time, it was seen to be a sign of a woman's success if she actually had a lot of children. Marianne ended up having 15 children. That's pretty huge. But also, Marianne actively had a hand in crafting her ancestral myth. So there's an element of the story that we haven't touched on yet, and that's that in her death certificate, it says that Marianne is actually from the Bay of Islands in New Zealand and has Maori heritage. This is something that her son was the informant of the death certificate, and so it seems that this is something that was carried through the family. And there are at least a few newspaper articles from the 1860s where it seems that Marianne has made mention of Maori heritage.
Wow.
Now, she definitely was not Maori. And so the next question, of course, is why would someone who has Aboriginal heritage, why would they claim to be Maori? There are a couple of things going on. So Maori always had higher status in British eyes than Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people were seen by white colonists to be in the lowest rungs of kind of the social and the evolutionary ladder. Maori people had recognized systems of government and were apparently very warlike in ways that the British identified and gave them some modicum of respect. But actually, when we look at the end of Marianne's life, we see that there's increasing government intervention into Aboriginal people's lives and the beginning of what we now know as the stolen generation. So government taking Aboriginal children from their families and institutionalizing them, putting them into care. And so by changing her story at the end of her life, she's actually able to protect her family. She very likely stopped her children and grandchildren from being taken and from that kind of being under that state and government surveillance. And that for me is the remarkable bit. That for me is the part that we should really be celebrating, and it also makes us question whether someone's, I guess, fading from the records or from historical attention is always a sign of their failure, or whether we can actually read that according to their own motivations and see that as a sign of success.
Mm. Do you get a sense that her, in this later life where she is kind of a settled matriarch, do you get a sense that her neighbours would have known that she was Thunderbolt's lady?
It's really hard to tell. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know from interviewing one of her descendants that a woman from the kind of Newcastle area of New South Wales only discovered a few years ago that she actually was related to Marianne, but also that she had Aboriginal heritage. The kind of oral history, the family history that was still passed down was that there was some Maori heritage in her family. And so that seems to have been kind of a hidden part of her family's history until relatively recently. So the ongoing legacies of that kind of continue almost up until the present day.
She's a remarkable person. Absolutely. One of several, of course, in the book. We also meet Sam Poo and Black Douglas in this book. One is a traveller from the Chinese region of Amoy, the other a free African-American man from Philadelphia. And this intercontinental inquiry into the lives of people who are often marginalised is painstaking. Any historian knows that a paragraph that sort of sets the scene often takes weeks of research. And this is a book that spans continents and follows these people as they travel. And I wonder if you might tell us about how you go about building these worlds that people travel through, and tell us how that helped you to understand William Douglas.
Yeah, sure. So this is where history is really like detective work, especially when you're looking at people like her in this book, people of color and women who are not at the center of these archives. And it's important to note, I think, that even white male bushrangers, although they were criminalized, we have a lot more information about their lives. So petitions for clemency through to, hysterical government commissions trying to figure out how can we stop these bushrangers? How can we look at their backgrounds to figure out how we can prevent this happening in the future. We know a lot more about them than the people that I talk about in the book. And so it really comes from reading every scrap of information you can and trying to situate that in as much context as possible. So in the case of Douglas, it was coming across a very critical source, which was a convict indent. So Douglas is infamous on the Victorian goldfields of the 1850s. None of the gold miners at the time seem to be very interested in his background. He's known as Black Douglas. We don't even get a sense of his ethnic origins. We don't know that he's African American from that material in the gold rush, really. It's only by looking backwards and actually discovering this convict context that we can see there's a lot more at play. So convict sources are actually some of the richest sources in the world when it comes to piecing together the lives of ordinary working class people. And the reason behind that is not benign. They were designed to be, I guess, what we would call a kind of written mugshot. The idea being that you recorded as much detail about the convict as possible, not just where they come from, but physical things, their height, their eye color, their tattoos. And you do this so if they escape, you've got a record to kind of look back at and say, okay, well, I know this is Douglas who escaped. But for me as an historian, that type of source is gold because it contains information like Douglas's point of origin, which is Philadelphia in the United States. So knowing something like Douglas's location at a certain time and also his birth date, so he was born in 1817, then that gives me enough details to start looking. And I couldn't find anything that named Douglas at this point in time, so no birth records, for example. But I could, as you say, go about world building. So reading as much as possible. What was it like for an African American man of his age at this time? What were the opportunities that he had? What were the kind of obstacles barring his way? And in terms of mobilities, how did he get from one point to the other? How did he get from Philadelphia through to Rye in Sussex in England, where he was convicted of larceny, and then finally to the Australian colonies? And so this is where world building is kind of matched with, I guess, educated guesswork, imaginative reconstruction that's based in sources. And so the most likely way that Douglas got from Philadelphia to Rye in Sussex is as a seafarer, because that was one of the opportunities open to African American men at this time. It fits someone of Douglas's age at the time as well, and he's later referred to as a cook/servant, which was a common position on a ship for someone of Douglas's skin color and also his age. So this is the kind of thing that hopefully gives everyone a sense of that kind of that piecing together of different bits of information, but trying to situate them within a wider reading of context. What's happening at a time and place, and what are the kind of opportunities and the obstacles that someone is likely to have faced.
What happened in Rye exactly? Because you've really got to know some of the locals in an almost disturbingly close way, Meg, as you're trying to piece this together.
Yeah, so in Rye, Douglas and an accomplice are accused of stealing 2 woolen coats, and this is in January, I might add. So in the Northern Hemisphere, this is the dead of winter. They're apparently caught red-handed in the theft as well, and so it seems, you know, just from that brief overview, like a pretty clear-cut case. But I dug a bit deeper because, yeah, like a dog with a bone, I need to know everything. And so I found this remarkable source, just one tiny slip of paper, but it had the people present at the trial. And so that led me to look at censuses and, you know, reports of different businesses in the area and different types of local histories to figure out, you know, who were these people at Douglas's trial and what was their stake in the trial. And the answer is they all did have a stake, right down from someone who was very likely the person who sold these coats to their current owner, all the way through to a publican whose license had been denied several times and would very likely lose it again if he didn't do what the authorities wanted. And that idea of knowing what the authorities wanted is particularly important in Rye, because Rye is actually somewhere that is not under the central administration of London at this time. It's something called a cinque port. And this means that it could control local justice, local administration of the law. And usually when there's a case that could be like a severe case, this would be sent to the assizes. This would be kind of referred up, I guess. It was only local justice that would be dealt with by Rye. But they chose to prosecute Douglas and his accomplice in Rye, which got me then wondering, well, what is going on in terms of local politics? Why? Why is this man, I think, being made an example of? And then we also have some statistics as well. So the entire duration of convict transportation to the Australian colonies, so from 1788 through to 1867, there are 7 men from Rye who were ever transported to the Australian colonies. There are only 2 before Douglas and his accomplice. So it's a very unusual punishment. And so this got me really looking into what's happening in local politics. Why was this the case? And I came up with the fact that the local government had been changing. This particular family that had been the kind of mayors and rulers of Rye for quite a long time had actually fallen out of power. There's increasing enfranchisement, more middle class people are getting the vote. And so this is the first new mayor since this kind of established dynasty is out of power. And one of the policy moves is a robust stance on crime, is what they're kind of platforming. And lo and behold, that coincides with Douglas being sent to Australia. So, in a nutshell,
Not
there
much
is,
changes by the
yeah,
sounds of things.
a
And
few conflicts of interest were going on.
mhm. And he was in the wrong place at a time when, being tough on crime was the talk of the town. Is that correct? And that was
Exactly.
how he ended up in Australia. And so all of this has happened before he even arrives in southeastern Australia. And then lots happens before he even makes it to the goldfields. Can you tell us a little bit about his time once he reaches the Antipodes?
Yeah. So Douglas doesn't just stay in Sydney where he comes off the ship from England into Sydney. He's moved to down the south coast, originally as a kind of convict worker. He eventually escapes and has one very unspectacular stint as a bushranger. And I say unspectacular, it's so sad for someone who's renowned as a bushranger later in life. The only time he actually does it. He is caught immediately, basically immediately afterwards. He's identified as a person of color, although not from his face, from his hands. He wore a handkerchief over his face. He seems to have robbed someone quite close to where he was actually employed as a convict and gone back with the booty to his convict quarters and was kind of found in possession of the goods. So he then is sent to Tasmania, what was then known as Van Diemen's Land, so a place of secondary punishment. This is not somewhere you wanted to be sent in the early 19th century. It was somewhere deliberately designed to deter convicts from committing crimes in the Australian colonies. The idea was that under this system called the probation system, a convict was meant to work their way to reform and, I guess, enlightenment in the best case scenario as well. So they started with hard labour, they started with few indulgences, and the idea was eventually they would work off their sentence and there would be more leniency. But Douglas is pretty unique in that he's a massive recidivist. This system does not reform him, he pushes back against it. So he is repeatedly reprimanded from things like forced labor, being put in solitary confinement as well, which at the time was a particularly heinous and unusual punishment, considering how often convicts were with their fellows. They were together basically at all times. But Douglas actually suffered, I think it was about 56 days in total solitary confinement throughout the course of his time in Tasmania. And he keeps acting out, he keeps pushing back, and that is quite distinctive, and I think really speaks to his character and this impulse throughout his life. He has, the way I see it, it's a quest for freedom. His mobility at the beginning was a quest for more freedom, and even as he is coerced into his movement in the Australian colonies, the way that he acts and the way he pushes back seems all to me to kind of be undergirded by this sense of needing to have his own liberty.
He comes across as a person of remarkably fierce will and sense of purpose in how he moves through space. It's a remarkable story. And it leads me to think about Black Douglas as this much feared bushranger. What did people think that he had done on the goldfields? And what did he actually do?
Yeah, so Douglas, I guess the best way to characterize him on the goldfields, he's kind of like this colonial boogeyman.
Mhm.
So he was accused of, well, basically anything. People thought, if they'd had a dish of their tailings, like the little pieces of gold, had been stolen, they thought it was Black Douglas.
Right.
We've got some really great cases of someone who basically said he engaged in sly grog selling because he lived in such a state of fear from Black Douglas that, he had to indulge. But the crime that has followed him and that has added to the kind of the myth around him in his own time was this murder of a white woman at the goldfields at Avoca. So this is the crime that actually led to a near lynching as well. So miners apparently heard of this crime, this murder of a white woman, and they were driven to protect their property, but also kind of protect their idea of law and order on the diggings. So they surrounded Douglas, they captured him and his gang. It was violent, so they fought with picks and shovels. Eventually, Douglas and his men were bound up and put in a cart, and there were moves to lynch them. And it was only one police officer very vocally trying to convince these diggers that, justice could be served by going to a nearby town of Maryborough and letting, Her Majesty's justice actually work, that luckily the diggers kind of backed down and Douglas was carted to Maryborough instead. So this crime is the one that even later in the 1880s, 1890s, people who had been miners in the goldfields are writing their reminiscences by this time, and they're still referring to Douglas and this murder as like a pivotal moment. And of course, as an historian, you can't take anything for granted. So I was like, what is the evidence? What is the evidence that he actually committed this murder? Short story and a spoiler for anyone who wants to read the book. He didn't do it. The murder is, there are 5 intimately described white assailants who commit this murder of this white woman at Avoca. And so I guess the next question is, well, why did this story take root and why did it have such traction? How did it have such an impact? And that really is what the rest of that particular chapter is about, trying to trace the context of the goldfields, that kind of tumultuous nature of it, the way that it really threw a lot of colonial ideas about race on their head, because anyone could strike it rich on the goldfields, right? It didn't matter your ethnic background, it didn't matter your gender. It was a world that a lot of white miners saw as topsy-turvy. And so in this story of Douglas murdering a white woman, although it's distressing for white miners and also the women in the goldfields too, because of course there were women on the goldfields, the story actually served a purpose of making the world make sense again to these white colonists. So having a black man as a clear villain and a white woman as the clear victim really made sense and helped to restore a lot of white miners' idea of what the world should look like. And that I kind of argue by piecing together, once again, world building, really gives us a compelling reason why this story had such traction and such purchase.
It's fascinating stuff, and it sounds like Black Douglas may be a good excuse if anyone wants to call in sick tomorrow as well. It sounds like it could be
absolutely.
Yeah, a remarkable dislocation of myth from the reality of a person's life. And I guess one of the key things from this is that bushranging, you write about it being not something that people did for their whole lives. I mean, we've already seen that with Mary Ann Bugg.
Completely. I think that's something that, once again, going back to what I said at the beginning, trying to separate that myth from the reality. We think of bushrangers today as a type of person. So Ned Kelly is a bushranger. Ben Hall was a bushranger. But these are actually very short episodes. And in some instances, it wasn't uncommon for someone to see an opportunity to commit bushranging. So, you might come across a lone traveler on a road and you're a bit down on your luck. There's no one else around. You might rob them. But in some instances, if you weren't caught, you'd rob them and then go back to your everyday life. So that idea that we have that bushranging is a personality type or it defines someone in their essence doesn't actually equate to who majority of bushrangers were at the time in the 19th century.
Which leads us to another character in the book or protagonist, and that's the story of Sam Poo, which strikes me as one that was very challenging to put together from, the perspective of historical work. Can you tell us a little bit about Sam Poo and why or what it was like delving into that history?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, Sam Poo is kind of known as Australia's only Chinese bushranger. He's meant to have committed bushranging crimes. Apparently, this Senior Constable Ward, heard that there was a bushranger in the Mudgee area of New South Wales. He then spied Sam Poo, the suspect, called on him to surrender. And the story is that Sam Poo shot him and Ward was fatally wounded in his pelvis and he died. So this is a story that's still known in local memory, and there have been some commemorative events for this senior constable, which from my perspective is quite interesting, right? Because it throws upside down, it inverts this idea of the police always being the villains in the bushranging story. In this instance, this one was actually celebrated and lauded as a hero, for a kind of fallen hero in his own time. But the story and the myth, once again, doesn't actually reflect the evidence that we have. So I actually went back and found the court records and found the depositions and started looking into, okay, well, what evidence is there that this person, Sam Poo, who was executed for this crime of murder, is actually the one who committed it? There is a lot to indicate that the person who was executed, in fact, did not commit this crime. Most of the depositions talk about seeing a Chinese man. He was dressed as a Chinese man. He was seen in the area afterwards. Therefore, it must be Sam Poo. From reading around other evidence, there are a lot of Chinese men in the area at that time, walking from goldfield to goldfield. It wasn't unusual. And the idea that he was dressed as a Chinaman, that's a quote from one of the sources. Even Ward himself in his dying declaration says it makes no matter what he was wearing because he could just change his clothes. That it's not a defining feature. And the only real source that we have that indicates who this person was who killed the senior constable is Ward's dying declaration, where he says he was shot by a short, cranky, old Chinese man. Sam Poo was quite tall, he was muscular, he was in his 30s. So this is not matching the description at all that we have. And so that really blows apart this idea that that Sam Poo was in fact the person who committed this murder. And there's also no evidence about him committing bushranging crimes either. That was never brought to court. There were never any depositions about that. So it's very, very patchy. But one thing I did want to do when looking at Sam Poo's story was once again not confine it to this encounter with the law, to try to say, well, who was he before 1865, where he becomes a kind of a symbol in newspaper articles and arguments about this particular bushranging act refer to his case. Who was he before that discourse? Who was he as a person? And that also, once again, as in the case of Douglas, required piecing together different bits of information, trying to actually situate them in context. And in this instance, it was one jail register that said that Sam Poo was from a place called Amoy in China that really completely exploded a lot of preconceptions about his backstory. Because the kind of very racist view of stories about Sam Poo that were written in 1900 were essentially that he was a greedy gold miner who came out and saw that bushranging was a lot easier and more profitable than gold mining, and that was kind of the way that he entered the bushranging game. The people who came from Amoy to Australia were not part of this bushranging migration. They'd actually come decades before as indentured labourers to help clear the land when convict labour had stopped being sent to the Australian colonies. And so he was part of a very different story and had actually been in the colony for quite some time. And the other thing that's quite heartbreaking to note is we don't have Sam Poo's voice at all. And the colonial authorities said that that was because he was deliberately holding his tongue. So that's actually the first trial to decide whether he was deliberately holding his tongue or whether there was divine intervention. Through looking at the sources, it seems very likely because Sampu was bashed in the head with the butt of a rifle so hard that the butt of the rifle smashed to pieces. He had been thought so badly wounded he wouldn't live. Eventually he did, but he was still very emaciated when he was before the courts. And that's just not referred to at all. But Sampu didn't speak at his trial. We have no evidence of his voice. And so that's why putting him in that context, trying to rebuild his world is so important, because he is literally rendered voiceless by the colonists that he encountered.
It's an incredibly sad story, and one that, you know, as with many moments in the book, brings us face to face with this, you know, deep current of racism that people faced as they moved through this part of where we live today. So, Meg, that has gone incredibly quickly, and we are nearly at question time. So, while I peer into the Q&A and see what kinds of questions might be appearing in there, please pop your questions for Meg into the Q&A box so that she can answer them and bring more light and stories to the conversation. So while we wait for that, I guess my question is, what would you like people to take away with them today when they think about bushranging?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the key point is that bushranging heroes, national heroes, are not organic. They're not natural. We've inherited these figures from colonial times. But also, as I hope has been clear from our conversation, bushranging should be where we start to look at these people's stories, not where we stop. So it's very important to try to recover how each of these individuals saw their own lives. They're not just, you know, an Aboriginal Ned Kelly or a Chinese Ben Hall. There's a lot more going on. And I think to really do justice to each of their lives, we need to see them as close as possible on their own terms.
And the remarkable thing about the book is that it leads us into all of these parallel idioms of Chinese banditry and other ways that people were experiencing crime and intimacy in ways that really confound some of our expectations. So we've got a question from Suzette. Thank you so much, Suzette. And Suzette has asked, are there any bushrangers who were able to serve their time and then go forward to a higher station in life and have successful businesses or other success? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would need to do more research on the white guys. I guess that's I guess the issue with my book is I use white male bushrangers as the foundation, then try to go beyond that. One person I can think of, not any character in my book per se, but the famous white bushranger Frank Gardner did manage to live a life after he served his sentence. So originally he was actually imprisoned for quite a long period of time. There was a petition afterwards. He was eventually released on the proviso that he was exiled. And he actually moves to the States and opens up a saloon and seems to have lived there till the end of his days and lived a quite prosperous life with his own business. So yeah, that's one I can think of off the top of my head. But I feel like that in itself is a project that's kind of ripe for inquiry too. Thanks, Suzette.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I'm also, and Suzette has written, that's great to hear. Thanks, Suzette. I've got a question about the end of the golden age of bushranging, which is such an, you know, evocative title for this period. And I'm wondering, how did that interact with changes in policing that were taking place? How did law enforcement even look on the goldfields and during the broader colonial period?
Yeah, that's a great question. To make things easier, I'll focus on New South Wales because Victoria has a slightly different history. But policing undergoes an immense change in the 1860s, in part brought about specifically because of the concern of bushranging. Bushranging is seen to be endemic at this time. It's actually the language they use. And so they try to professionalize, essentially. That's the kind of it in a nutshell. So previously there were 6 different police forces, and the one that was actually concerned most with bushranging, the rural constabulary, is the one that kind of underwent the most changes. So all of these police forces come together and become known as the new police. The rural constabulary had previously been largely ex-convicts, really, or sometimes even right back in the early period, convicts themselves. So they'd been actually employed to police their fellows, and this had led to quite a lot of issues when it came to corruption and being bought off. And so the idea was, if you professionalize the force, if you import or get migrants from Ireland in particular, this new idea of a professional police force was based largely on the Irish constabulary. So they brought a lot of Irish policemen over, and they were taught how to kind of, you know, march in formation and sport sabers, but they weren't taught about the bush. And that was a big issue, of course. And while it was important to kind of break networks of, I guess, collusion between police and criminals, actually embedding police in those community networks had been incredibly important for them actually getting information, getting tip-offs, and having their own version of the now renowned bush telegraph that was available to bushrangers. And so this is happening at the same time, these great changes. In a lot of the newspapers at the time, police are denigrated. They're kind of almost laughed at because they're seen to be, you know, unsuccessful. And when you've got a bushranger who's basically an excellent bushman as well, versus, you know, a guy with a saber, it's easy to see why. But if we actually look at the kind of statistics, and a historian called Susan West has very compellingly argued that they actually did pretty well, these police officers. They adapted pretty quickly, and considering the kind of the poor equipment they have in particular and that lack of experience, they actually were pretty good at actually putting bushranging down.
Fascinating, and one of those moments where you realise that so much of what we take for granted in our present has of course been built up over time and been through multiple waves of development. And a police force, which you just kind of expect to be there, has a history as well. And that's beautifully explained, Meg. Thank you. We've got a question from Jackie, who asks about William Buckley, and I'm assuming this is William Buckley, who was the escaped convict who lived among the Kulin Aboriginal people in the pre-settler colonial period here in Victoria. I don't know, has your research or sort of, is he part of the convict story that you have told, Meg? The question is, how does William Buckley fit into your research, and was he more myth or an exception? Also, fascinating discussion. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I don't look at William Buckley directly, but one thing he does lead me to think about, which I have researched, is the kind of the crossover between concerns about white colonists and their interactions with Aboriginal people and how that relates to bushranging. So actually there is a crossover. So a lot of early resistance fighting by Aboriginal people, especially very coordinated attacks, they're actually seen to be the product of white bushrangers. And this is actually something that is interesting in terms of Marianne Bugg's own family history. So referring back to the bushranger in my book, her father and mother were both involved in an attack by other Aboriginal people. And later the authorities said, well, the attack's so coordinated, it must be led by a white gang of bushrangers or a white bushranger, because the conception was that Aboriginal people were incapable of coming up with those types of tactics. We know that they actually did. They were incredibly smart, incredibly savvy, incredibly ferocious in defending their country. But part of a kind of legislative intervention that comes in after that comes in, at least in part, to try to separate white bushrangers from Aboriginal people. And that the impetus behind that, the reason, is twofold. So on the one hand, they said, you know, we don't want white people corrupting Aboriginal people. We don't want them leading them to violence. But on the other hand, they didn't want Aboriginal people to influence white people either. So that's where the William Buckley kind of thing comes in. They were concerned that Aboriginal people and white people, when they got together, would cause the so-called superior whites to regress. And I'm putting all of this in inverted commas. So there were deep concerns that actually white people were not naturally superior, that in fact they were corruptible. And so these types of engagements and encounters and interactions between lower class convict bushrangers and Aboriginal people was something that was a real concern of authorities, especially in the 1820s, 1830s.
It's pushing a lot of buttons around race, around class, around ideas of civility, at a time when those things are really very fluid. And people are trying to establish themselves in all kinds of ways. So these boundary figures really push those buttons.
Completely.
I've got a question, and it's partly sparked by a piece of bushranger kitsch that I happen to have here, which is a Ned Kelly creme brulee torch that I found in a local disposable creme brulee torch, because you never know when you might need one of those, in a local convenience store. And I guess I have the question, with all of this wild mythologizing, what is the sort of most out there artifact that you've come across in your research, from related to bushrangers and the mythologizing of bushrangers? And it could be from the present or from a previous period as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some pretty kooky stuff out there. I actually have a slide that I sometimes use where I've got like all different things together. And of course, you've got your typical stubby holders, which are not the kookiest. There's a Ned Kelly hearse. So
What?
like, yeah, the car that carries coffins, someone has done this huge artistic rendition of Ned Kelly's face and his armor. And I think that's particularly interesting, especially considering there's actually forensic pathology research that shows that people with Ned Kelly tattoos today are in fact more likely to die by either suicide or die violent deaths.
No.
Yeah. So that's research that's actually come out quite recently. And so there does seem to be a correlation between Ned Kelly and violence today. And so I think it would be actually quite interesting to interview people about their thoughts about their, Kelly tattoos and thoughts about bushrangers and what they mean and how that kind of sits with their own worldviews, because obviously there's a lot going on there to unpack.
Yeah, and it's especially when stories such as these are being brought to light as well that really confound that understanding that people think they have of their this particular anti-hero of Australian culture. There's many beaming comments in the chat from people thanking you for sharing your knowledge tonight, Megan. And I've certainly enjoyed the chat, as always. Boundary Crosses, which everyone must read, is published by New South and is also available to borrow from Geelong regional libraries. You can also purchase a copy of the book from the local bookstore, and that has just been put into chat as well. And yes, so do get your hands on one of those books, and we will be going online as well on YouTube soon. So on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you, Alex. It's been great. And thank you, Geelong Library, for having us.
Thank you, Geelong Library, and to everyone who's come along with us tonight. Have a great night. Bye.
Bye.